to access all areas of SEND, the podcast. Today, I'm joined by the lovely Tina Coope, who is a former teacher, joined Pans and Pandas UK in 2021 as an education lead. Driven by her own family's lived experience, she's developed the UK's first training course for teachers and educational psychologists on Pans and Pandas, and has created a wide range of resources to support professionals. Tina also serves as co-chair of the Pans and Pandas Educational, Social Care and Health Group, which is working to develop local authority guidance. Thank you very much for joining us. So, going straight into it, tell us, what is Pans and Pandas? Because a couple of years ago, I'd never even heard of it. And it's only through a chance conversation that you and I had quite a few years ago now, where we were discussing this and you introduced me to your wonderful organisation. But explain to everybody on the podcast what it is.
Thank you for inviting me and the lovely introduction. And yeah, if you haven't heard of Pans and Pandas, you're definitely not alone. So they are acronyms they've got long names. So PANS stands for Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome, and PANDAS stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Streptococcal Infections. And in essence, these are medical conditions, proposed post-infectious neuroinflammatory conditions, and they affect the brain and cause sudden changes in behaviour and functioning. So PANDAS is always linked to a strep infection, so it's triggered by strep, so that might be strep throat or scarlet fever, for example, whereas PANS has got a much wider set of triggers, so for example, chickenpox, flu, pneumonia, COVID-19 in some cases. And the symptoms of these medical conditions are neuropsychiatric, and that means they affect mood, behaviour and cognitive functions. And people always say, oh gosh, so much terminology, what actually is it? So in really simple terms, following an infection, the child or young person usually gets better, and then they develop a proposed neuroinflammatory response that affects their brain, and they come out with this whole wide scope of symptoms, neuropsychiatric symptoms, and that's known colloquially as a flare. And some of the key symptoms can be obsessive compulsive behaviour, restricted eating and tics. And I think the one other thing that's really important to share is that despite the P in PANS, which stands for pediatric, it's so confusing because actually PANS can affect anyone at any age. And whilst PANDAS is a pediatric diagnosis, we know that from some of our families, those symptoms don't automatically resolve at 16, 18, or even beyond.
Wow, I mean, it's such a huge condition that actually is triggered by something that lots of children have in their childhood, isn't it? I mean, I know my children, and they've had loads of tonsillitis, colds, strep throat, and it's just. So is there anything that sort of preempts that inflammation, or does it's just random in its choice of how it progresses from the strep throat to the Pans and Pandas condition?
I think you bring up a really good point there, because we know that all children and young people get infections and strep throat and sometimes repeated bouts of strep throat. And I think in short, the answer is we don't really know yet what causes it. So scientists suspect there may be genetic links. They suspect there's some environmental research factors influence it. But in essence, we need to do more research to find out why this is happening.
And so what does it look like in children and young people, and how does it present them how does it present in the classroom? What is the things that we can see in our children, or if you're a teacher or an educator and you can see children within your classroom, what are the signs, what are we looking out for, and what does it how does it present in children within the classroom?
And I wish in answer to that question, I could give you a really nice, clear and definitive answer. But the truth is, it's quite complicated and it presents differently in all children and young people. But some key points to hold in mind are we're looking for multiple unexplained changes in that child or young person. So you might see those changes in behaviour and learning. So maybe a child who was previously thriving and managing perfectly fine, suddenly struggling with tasks that they could do before. If we think about in the classroom, sometimes we notice academic changes that are quite unusual. So handwriting can suddenly deteriorate and quite dramatically. Math skills can drastically drop, or perhaps reading becomes difficult. But I think the key to hold in mind is it represents a change for that individual child. We often see quite fluctuating performance, so children might be coping quite well and be quite able, and then they'll have a flare up and all of those skills will kind of regress. And often everybody's standing around the child saying, what has happened? What has happened for this child? We might also see emotional dysregulation, but again, key thing, it represents a change in that particular child. So tearfulness or withdrawal. New onset sensory needs, again, unusual to have this out of the blue, seemingly. So you might have this sudden onset sensory processing difficult, how they tolerate noise, light, touch, smells, clothing, or busy environments. You can also see extreme anxiety quite often, especially separation anxiety. So a child who was at the school gate and was fine saying goodbye to, mum or dad, suddenly they find that so challenging. They become so distressed at leaving parents or carers, and that can so easily be misinterpreted. And then usually in Pans and Pandas separation anxiety, that doesn't abate through the school day. Children are persistently and severely kind of anxious. And you might see examples of obsessive compulsive behaviours. And again, it's hard to recognise and know that they're obsessive compulsive behaviours, and that's important to know. So you might see, I don't know, rewriting things. Sometimes children keep rubbing things out. Persistent checking, have I done something wrong? Is something bad going to happen? Very strong reactions to seating routines, reluctance to use school toilets or communal areas, and you're likely to only see the superficial kind of manifestations of obsessive compulsive thoughts. There's likely to be a lot more going on internally. Eating restrictions can also occur.
So it's literally like a light switch, isn't it? From knowing your child to then suddenly for a child to be displaying these behaviours, these needs. It's something that is literally out of the ordinary, is what you're sort of describing, isn't it? It's like, your child always loved school, goes into school, and then all of a sudden doesn't, and may have had some sort of infection in between, but it's really difficult, isn't it, to pinpoint something to that event if they're suddenly like changing their behaviour. So in regards to the support of the needs, how can educators support the children? That's helpful with families as well, obviously, because you've got to do it in together, haven't you? But how do you support those needs in education? What can educators do to support?
So I think there's a lot we can do to support the needs. But the first key I think that you highlighted is this kind of light bulb change. And it's also recognition of the need. And it's recognition of the onset of need and the psychological impacts of that on a child who was previously able to perhaps do things much more easily than they suddenly can. There's that. There's the pattern of the need, in which case they fluctuate. So children can have periods where they've got a real complex wealth of needs and require lots of support, and then other periods where things may be more stable health-wise, and some of those supports can be kind of reduced. But there's also the full recognition, so not just the visible impacts that we can see at Pans and Pandas, but also what's going on inside. Because some children have quite visible symptoms, so they might have tics or changes in fine or gross motor skills, for example, and some children will have a lot more internal symptoms, and they can also flux and change over time. But in terms of looking at support, so once we've accurately recognised the need, I think it's really helpful to think of Pans and Pandas as cyclical, so it goes in a cycle. So you've got the child at baseline, then you've got the trigger, then you've got the flare up and all of the needs arising. Then you've got a slow period of recovery that's very variable. And then what we hope is that the child will go back to their baseline, but they don't always, unfortunately. And so I think whilst the child is acutely flaring, it's about recognizing, well, they might not be even well enough to be in school. And if they're not, that needs to be seen as a, as a medical need and catered for in that way. But if they are in school, it's about reducing curriculum demands, reduce the demands on them, sensory safe spaces, breaking down the tasks, one-to-one reassurance for what's happening to them, because it's really frightening for children. Having that lovely flexibility around attendance, looking at the long-term picture of the child's experience in education, low stimulus environments, and obviously adaptations for symptoms such as compulsions or tics. And then I think if you go on to the recovery phase, and again, this isn't going to be linear. It's likely to be up and down, confusing, people not really knowing what's happening. But it's then about that gradual reintegration, but with using the child's voice and agency and thinking about not just are they ready from a physical point of view, but are they in the space to engage, thinking about their social, emotional, and mental health needs with what they've been through. So modifying their workload again, prioritizing just some key learning rather than catching up everything, confidence rebuilding, nurture. And also that monitoring for fatigue or any early warning signs, because in that cycle, at any given point, unfortunately, the child can flare up again. And then during remission or the more stable phase, it's about maintaining helpful adjustments, that regular check-ins to spot any subtle changes, strength-based activities to build confidence, and planning ahead this time. So if you know it's happening and you know that a child's got this pattern of needs, it's about looking ahead and, putting in place an individual healthcare plan, and all of those things. And then if there's a reflare, it's about acting really quickly next time. So reducing those demands long before the child or young person reaches crises, reconnecting with the family, sharing that key information and putting back those flare phase adaptations in place without delay, and prioritization of emotional safety, anxiety reduction and relationship-based support.
And with families listening to this podcast and going, I recognise my child in everything that you've listed, how do they even begin to have that conversation with, practitioners, health practitioners, school, how do you start the conversation? Because until I found you and spoke to you, those years ago, I didn't even know what Pans and Pandas was. It was only a chance conversation. So you're doing some amazing work to try and share the knowledge that you have and what that condition is. But for a standalone family who are going, well, everything that you've described is my child, how do you begin that conversation about it? And because it is tricky, isn't it? So how do you do that?
It's really tricky. It's really tricky with like low levels of awareness across, the board of health education and social care practitioners. There are some key things that might help. One of those is to know that support is based on need and not diagnoses, and that the law requires support based on impact, functioning, and barriers to learning. So if you can kind of hold that in mind, while you're exploring potential diagnoses. So one of the phrases you can use is, my child or young person's needs determine support and not their diagnoses, to kind of hold that in mind. And then it's about documenting that impact. So using everyday neutral type of language. Focus on what practitioners can observe firstly. So these sudden behavioural or mood changes, severe anxiety, obsessive compulsive behaviours, that type of thing, regression after illness, and any barriers to attendance or learning. A couple of caveats with that is your child may be presenting differently at home and at school, and to know that this is not unusual at all in the cases of PANS or PANDAS. And referring back to what we briefly referenced earlier in terms of invisible symptoms, to make sure that the whole picture is focused on. So if you can share the observations of sudden changes and recent infections, provide that evidence, ask the school to help as well. What have they noticed? And what sometimes families tell us is, well, this school didn't know my child before these changes occurred. A really good point. So if they didn't, ask them to check back on a previous setting. And if you've got any external observations on all of those things, they can all help to build up this comprehensive picture of home and school when the changes occurred, and that these particular changes are unusual in terms of that child's profile.
And it's such a tricky thing, isn't it, to suddenly have this child completely different to what they were before, and have that conversation. And somebody might be saying, well, it's their age, their development, the sort of, they might be anxious over something else. And it's just like you say, keep a diary, write things down, think about when the first symptoms appeared. Was there any link to other infections? I think is really, really important. And I suppose, it must be tricky for families. And I mean, you must come across lots of families come to you and say, how about they were feeling around, the child in front of them that's suddenly changed, and they've known about Pans and Pandas. How it must be so difficult, isn't it? Because it must be scary. It must be an anxious time. So how do we support the families through this?
It's a really good question, and I think it's important to just acknowledge it just is really difficult on so many levels. Firstly, as you say, to kind of witness the change in your own child, which is often hugely distressing. Secondly, to try and convey those changes to the professionals supporting your child, which is not it's not always easy to get across the extent. And also because the symptoms kind of fluctuate and change, that can also be really perplexing. So, for example, if a child is then assessed during the height of a flare, the outcomes of that assessment are going to be really different to whether if the child is assessed, during a different trajectory in the condition. But those changes might be assumed to be permanent when they can actually be transient. So I always think for families, what's really helpful is connecting with other families that are going through the same experience. And the charity's obviously got a Facebook group. We've got 7,500 families, I think, now on that journey, kind of sharing those experiences, but also sharing kind of practical tips, how to work with professionals, where to go and get the medical advice. How do you advocate for medical evaluation if that's what you think, might be needed? Or how do you support school staff who might look at it and think, well, this might be autism or it might be ADHD, because they haven't heard of Pans or Pandas yet, and there's some symptom overlap. So I think those are some of the key things.
And I did a podcast episode a couple of weeks ago, actually, around with parent carers, and we did touch on sort of the gaslighting conversations, and we use that term, but it might not be in the true sense of the word. And it is really about being heard, isn't it, and ignored. And like you've just said, Pans and Pandas it's a relatively newly talked about conditions, isn't it? And so you may, I'm not going to say across the board, you may have to have those challenging conversations where you repeat yourself constantly, you go back, you might have a second opinion or whatever. And that is really tricky to manage for some families. So what support is there for families out there? Because it might be as well, they're going to have really tricky conversations with family members that might not understand, might not believe what they're saying. And so when you're dealing with all of that, it's really hard, as well as seeing your child, what you think is suffering and or is different, or a little bit more challenging. So what support is there for families that are going through all of that whilst navigating the system, whether it's at school or whether it's in health, to try and understand their child and get the support that they need?
It's a really good question. And, you know, when you just brought up about parents having to repeat themselves several times, and we know that even that can be seen as a red flag by professionals. So even the very basics that parents currently need to do to negotiate the health and education journey can be then misinterpreted against them, even though any parent would naturally be advocating on behalf of their children. They might be going to multiple doctors to seek, you know, care if they can't work out what, you know, what's going on with their children. And some of the support networks out there at the moment are, we've obviously got the charity website. They've got resources for health, education and social care professionals as well that you can kind of signpost for alongside families and young people and children themselves. We've also got teacher training that we run every month via Eventbrite. It's free. It's aimed at education professionals, but anybody is welcome to come along to those sessions. And lots of people from different professions have come along and said it's been helpful. And those are running via Twinkle Teach Me as well. We've got this lovely youth advisory board for the children and young people themselves to kind of connect to. We've got face-to-face support group meetings now for parents as well. And we would also ask that anybody who's either listening to the podcast or going to the website, that they also share the information and resources with kind of their own wider professional network, so that we can kind of all work together to increase that awareness and those support networks.
Yeah, I think that's, sharing the information. It's the only reason why I did the podcast is
Totally.
purely because, everybody has a responsibility for inclusion, I think. And there is so much out there, from whether it doesn't matter what career you're in, it doesn't matter whether you're a parent or not. There is some conditions that we really do need to know about. And the only way we can get through life actually is to support each other. So that's why we generated this podcast. And we'll put a link into the website in the blurb and stuff to do with the podcast, because I think you're right, it is about sharing information. I'd love for people to share this podcast if they've listened to it and thought, actually I know of few families, or I know a family that could be affected by this. I'll share the information. So we've talked about the support, which is great. What sort of barriers, I suppose, are there in regards to getting support? Because what we know, is that councils are cash strapped, so are schools, and everybody's looking at the pennies, and are not reluctant. I think they would love to support more families, but just can't. So how what are the current barriers? And also, again, it's having that conversation with a practitioner, being told, well, actually, it could be anything. As you said, you've touched on that there's so many similarities and crossovers between autism, ADHD, SEMH, and all those acronyms. So how can we? What are the current barriers, I guess, and how can we help and support families to get answers or have those conversations? Or even if you're a practitioner and you're struggling and you know more about it and you want to help and support, what conversations can you have?
So I think the biggest barriers really are the current lack of awareness, and that's across education, health and social care professionals. So often these children will present with quite complex symptoms. There might be interprofessional disagreement. That's not unusual. Parents and carers may be reporting one set of symptoms, practitioners might see another. So I think one of the most significant barriers is that current lack of awareness. So I think what's really helpful is signposting any professionals. If you're in a case where you think it just may be, worth exploring, would be to kind of signpost them to those, to those resources. And other issues are that if you know that sometimes the symptoms can be misinterpreted, and they can, and this is a key issue really. It's about as well having that framework around professionals, that they know that in this particular case, however you're terming it, in terms of medical terminology, these needs are fluctuating. They've arisen suddenly and they're fluctuating. So therefore they need to be captured within the framework that they are, and identified and supported in line with other children with other needs. I think what parents also say can be a barrier is that the symptoms can be misinterpreted as something else. So sometimes behavioural, and they have punitive approaches to them. Or sometimes, as we touched on, neurodivergence. And we know that this is a growing area of understanding and that there's a lot that we don't know at the moment. But what parents and carers are reporting for their neurodivergent children is firstly that any new or acute symptoms are sometimes incorrectly attributed to their previous neurodivergence rather than recognised or explored as part of a possible medical condition. And we also know, Tina, that neurodivergent children can also develop PANS or PANDAS, and sometimes that they're dismissed from having that kind of medical evaluation. And I guess that comes down again to the kind of training and awareness for professionals. We know also another barrier is inconsistent support across regions. So families were reporting a postcode lottery for the SEND provision for these children and the different responses for local authority. We don't have any UK clinical guidelines yet. They are coming, but they're not in place yet. So work is underway, but until then, both schools and practitioners are lacking in clear national direction. It's hard for them to know what do I do? Where do I go for information and resources? And the charity did send out a local authority update actually in January to all local authorities. And then we know about safeguarding. That's a whole complex area, but families and are reporting to us that they're disproportionately referred for safeguarding concerns or accusations of fabricated induced illness. And we know there's a number of vulnerabilities specifically associated with these conditions. And again, it comes down to kind of training and awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that, can't you? If a parent is really concerned, and we are the advocates, I'm a parent carer, we are the advocates for our children, and we need to be saying that to professionals and practitioners, don't we? And sort of saying this is not right. I just want to sort of, I know you're touching on what national work you're doing as an organisation, but I want to just skip that for a second because I know you've just briefly alluded to it in that comment. And I just want to just focus a little bit on the educational side because you've sort of touched on that as well. So, how does PANS and PANDAS affect the executive functioning skills?
So yeah, so we had some brilliant questions actually from our community, and this was one of those questions. So I think it's helpful first to outline what they are because we use this term a lot, and to just break them down. So executive functioning skills are planning and organising. So that's about making a plan and following the steps to complete the task. Working memory, which is about holding information in your mind while using it at the same time, which I'm trying to do now in the podcast and I'm struggling with, Tina.
No, you're doing a good job.
Flexible thinking, so that's about adjusting to changes or solving problems in new ways. Self-control, that's managing our emotions and impulses. Task initiation, so that's about managing to start a task and knowing where to start, and focus and attention. So lots and lots of skills that are key really within our education system. So what we know, and again they're all different, but what we know when a child or young person develops PANS and PANDAS is these particular skills can be disrupted. And please remember acute onset, so they might not have had these issues before. They could develop a spiky profile with these, so some areas could be affected and some not. So it all creates a lot of difficulty and confusion. So for example, difficulty planning and organising. So a child might sit down to start their homework, but they don't know what to begin with. And so they end up not doing anything. And I think the key thing is that's a change for that child. That might be a child who before managed their homework without any problems whatsoever.
Yeah.
They might get ready for school, but then be forgetting key steps. So not putting on shoes, brushing teeth, packing their bag, and things that they could do with ease before. Suddenly they can't do it. You're reminding them lots. Have you got this? Have you got that? They're making mistakes that worry you as a parent because this is not typical. for my child would not go outside without their shoes on. They would not forget their school bag. And you know that as a parent carer. And those are really helpful kind of red flags to hold in mind. And then poor working memory. So teacher might say, oh, get your English book out, turn to this page and answer the first 3 questions. And the child only remembers to get your book out. And the teacher might be saying, this is really unusual for this particular child. You know, they would be able to do this with ease. And or something like go and deliver a message to the office, but then they return and they haven't done it, or they've misunderstood the words that you've said. And again, everybody's saying something's wrong. This is not right for this child. Reduced attention. So you might see a child doodling, looking around the room, or at home they might start reading, but then just zone out. And we notice this a lot with children with Pans and Pandas. They just sort of zone out and then they might kind of come back to it again. You might see emotional dysregulation that interfere with their ability to make decisions. Small things might really upset them. A lot of our children don't know when to start a task. So when a teacher gives them a task, there's a lot of, I can't organise my thoughts in my head and I don't know where to start. Or at home, you might say, can you go and tidy your room, in the hope that they might do it. But then they literally don't know where to begin. They're kind of overwhelmed. So yeah, those are some of the ways, or some of the things that you might notice as a parent and carer that will really chime with you, where you think something is not right.
And it's about noting those changes, isn't it, when you're having those discussions again with the clinicians that we just talked about further into the, further back into the podcast. Okay, so if you've got an educator in front of you and they're looking at a child that was once sort of independent, could like just get on and do a task, to then suddenly can't, and they can't get their executive function in order, what could, what strategies could they do for that child and young person to be able to be supported if they think that there is Pans and Pandas? It might be that a parent has gone into the classroom and said, my child is drastically changed. We think it might be this. I've been to the GP and this is the conversation that we're having. How can that educator support that family and the child and young person within their classroom?
It's hard. I think it's about firstly recognising that you've got to look at the whole picture. So we can't just, for example, take executive functioning skills and look at those as an area in isolation, because those are likely to have been affected alongside new onset sensory needs, alongside obsessive compulsive behaviours, perhaps tics, restricted eating, and all of those things come together to make a cumulative impact on how the child is managing in the classroom. What I would say is that if a child is acutely unwell and they're flaring, they just cannot. So it's about compensation for those skills. So I think it's about reassuring the child that actually this is going to be okay. So at the moment, this is super tricky and we know that. So we don't expect that. We'll do this instead and that's fine. And then when that child's getting better, it comes back to understanding that cycle that I think we talked about earlier. When the child's better, then it may be time to just extend those expectations a little bit, but only in line with social and emotional and mental health needs. And recognizing that the fluctuation in those skills has a massive impact on a child's enjoyment in school, in their ability to achieve, in their feeling of belonging, in their peer friendships, because a lot of our children are self-aware of the changes that they've kind of gone through. And they're aware that they can't do things that they can perhaps do before. And children have described to us how that feels when they do some kind of test or work that they could do, or they sit next to their best friend and they were both writing 2 pages and they're now doing 2 lines of scrawly sentences. So I think the key thing is to recognise when a child can't because they're simply unwell, and compensate and change the expectation around that, but with a framework of why that is for the child. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense. And I've had plenty of conversations over the years and regularly with families around the difference between children who can't attend and children who won't attend. And there is a distinct difference. And what we're talking about here is, a child who is having a flare or is not very well, and they really cannot function, and it must be distressing. Children are aware of themselves. They are definitely aware of their surroundings, no matter what age they are. I've worked with children, and they are acutely aware of what's going on. And so, we touched on, and I've touched this on another episode, around sometimes you may have to make a decision that school environment might not be the right place for your child in the current situation that they're in. So they might be having a flare, so they might have to have some time off. It may be that you can look at alternative provisions. It might be that school can provide, because they can provide alternative provision to get their child out of the classroom, to make it more, sort of gentle, I suppose is the word, for that child. Is that a way of trying to manage a poorly child, or a child who is struggling on the back of, this flare, that they're currently in, and you're just trying to manage them, to make them better, to make them, to have more function around this condition, if that makes sense. And sorry if it doesn't.
It makes total sense. And I always feel that we need to be looking at the long-term picture.
Yeah.
So if a child is so acutely unwell that they are, that they're all of their skills that they need in school are impaired, then we're not only doing them a disservice by asking them to do things that they simply can't do, but that child is laying down experiences and memories, and they are forming their own sense of identity and self-esteem. And just as you said, Tina, if they're too unwell to be in school, they're too unwell to be in school. And we need to not see that as a negative, but as then we are supporting that child long term to engage as effectively as possible. So we're giving them time to get better, to heal, to feel well again. And then we do that very sensitive and supported reintegration into the classroom, whilst keeping connection while the child is, can't access the setting. But what we know from our families and community now is that we've got a lot of children and young people whose Pans and Pandas symptoms may not be acute currently, but they're still unable to access education. And there's a lot that we could have done to support those children from the very beginning of their journey. And going forward, so that children have a sense of safety. They know what's happening to them. They understand why they can't do things at a given point, and that the adults around them will hold them and keep them safe. And I really think we need to think about this, the long-term impact on our children. And just from a practical point of view, even understanding those fluctuating needs and the psychological impact on the child of having those needs, and periods of where they're unable to access anything, is just about having a coherent framework. Have we got the child's baseline? Have we captured the child's baseline before the first reported symptoms? That might be ages before diagnoses. And are we remaining aspirational for that child? Are we checking once they've gone round the cycle that any impaired skills have gone back to baseline? And are we able to share that with any clinical teams that are supporting the children? Because we know that for some of our children, their baselines are being lost. And over time, it's only parents and carers usually who knew what their, how their child was functioning and what they could do.
Yeah, and this goes back to the point of the parents being the advocate, isn't it? And just keeping a diary, writing down the differences. And it might be that all of a sudden you'll think, oh no, that's really different, that's really random, like, and just noting it down, isn't it? And just and also having communication with the teachers in the school. It's really important that you keep that communication up. You sort of, sorry, we you mentioned about the questions from our communities, and we've been really lucky that I do ask people, potential people who might listen to this podcast, about what they want from the episode that we're producing now. And we did have some medical questions, and we just want to touch on that, don't we? Because there were some really good questions, some very complicated questions, and very intricate questions. But some of them we're just not qualified, are we, to answer? But we want them to feel supported and heard. So for those families who've asked those very complicated medical questions, and thank you for that, where can they go for some advice around, finding out more around the medical side of things? Where can they go for those support?
So yeah, thank you so much for those that sent in the questions. So I think if you go to the part of the Pans Pandas website that's for healthcare professionals, you'll find a lot of really useful signposting information and links there. So that's helpful. And then for more informal forms of support, I think joining the Facebook support group, where you've got that real peer-to-peer and kind of community support, is really helpful. And I just wanted to pick up, because somebody asked as one of those questions about whether the condition is recognised by the NHS, and just to acknowledge they are recognised by the NHS. But there's no current national clinical pathway or standardised treatment protocol in the UK. So therefore, recognition is varying between regions and individual clinicians. And Tina, if I may, I just wanted to go back, because you pointed out something so important in terms of parents and carers creating a diary and writing the key events. And what I wanted to just reflect is that it's often the loudest symptoms or the most common symptoms that are focused on. And these might be anxiety, for example. And what's really important to capture at the start of the Pans and Pandas journey is to make sure that all of the impacts across different areas of the child's life have been captured, so that you have a balanced picture of the changing needs, so that when you go along to your GP, for example, the GP doesn't get a skewed view of, oh, this is only anxiety. So often on school letters or parents' observations, they might say, oh well, my child can't go to bed and that my child can't do this anymore, but they might not say, actually my child's handwriting's gone, or I'm really worried about their memory. And it's those types of symptoms as well, creating this holistic picture that may then alert a GP to think, could there be something more going on here, and do we need to undertake any medical evaluations on this child?
Yeah, I absolutely hear that, because when somebody's acting differently, it could be emotive, but when it's handwriting or when it's tying their shoelaces, then it can be neurological, couldn't it? And so they're looking at it from a different viewpoint. And so, if you think that you are concerned about your child and your child is different to what they used to be, please do keep a diary and do as Tina says, and just note everything down. Nothing is off the conversation, is it? You've just got to write everything down, all the changes, even minute changes, because they can be just as important as the big changes, isn't it? So going back to your wonderful charity, so your Pans and Pandas organisation, so what are you doing to help support the national stuff that's going on to improve, the situation for families, the actual recognition of the conditions, what sort of things, what things are you working on? Because I know you do some amazing, important work for families. So please share what you're doing in that regard.
So there's several streams, really, there's several work streams going on in the background. So we have got the organisation called the Pans Pandas Steering Group, and they include lots of representatives from major bodies like the British Paediatrical Neurology Association, Royal College of Psychiatrists, and many more. I won't list them all. And they convened essentially because of the situation whereby children weren't being diagnosed and treated, and they wanted to identify the current barriers to that, and then what we were going to do about it. So one of the things they did is they published an interim statement back in 2023, and that signposts clinicians now to 2 sets of peer-reviewed clinical guidelines. So that's the current recommendations from them. And then 4 working groups were then developed as a result of the steering group. And briefly, one of those is looking about how many children and young people are affected. One of those groups is creating clinical guidelines for the UK. They should be out towards the end of this year, and that's alongside the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. One of the group is a service specification group, so they'll be looking at, well, what pathways, what clinical pathways, who do we refer them to, and how's it going to work, you know, once we've got the guidelines in place. And then we've got the Education, Social Care and Health group, and they are working on creating advisory principles for local authorities, and they should also be out this year, fingers crossed.
So lots of work going on, loads of work around you know, people knowing about these conditions, because that's the huge thing, is it, that actually there's still people that really don't know of Pans and Pandas, and so we really need to share that awareness, don't we? And you also do some amazing work for families, so the signposting, the groups, the support network, which is so important, isn't it, when you've got conditions like this for your children? It is that village almost that we describe, isn't it, that, you know, there's support, that network that is there for those families, somebody to offload to, somebody to say, well, have you tried this, and, you know, with my child this worked. It's always important, isn't it, to do.
It's absolutely vital, isn't it? Because it's so isolating on so many different levels, and just to be heard and to be validated and to learn that other families are sharing similar experiences, and to take, you know, hints and tips from perhaps families that are further through the journey. Is everybody providing that support network for each other?
Yeah, no, I agree. Tina, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. And if you're listening to this podcast and you think that you recognise some of the things that we discussed, please go out and check the website and find the Facebook group if it affects you. And for those educators that want to learn more, find out we'll put a link in the podcast around the free training sessions around Pans and Pandas. Thank you again, Tina, for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tina.